So hello everyone, and I'm glad to join you remotely at your weekend in Blaythwaite. I hope you're having a really good time, and I hope you had a great time with Rob and Helen speaking to you yesterday. And it's a privilege to accept the invitation of Ed to come and address you remotely via video. I'm Martin Charlesworth, and my history is that I started life as a teacher. I went into business. I went into church leadership. I led a church in Shrewsbury for 20 years. Then I got involved in the wider ministries with New Frontiers and Christ Central. I got involved in a project called Jubilee Plus, which many of you will have heard of, which promotes social action in churches. I handed that over to my colleague Natalie Williams a little time ago. And I also run the training for Christ Central churches based in Sheffield, and run some training bases in other countries. And I also run a online resource called wordonline.org, which provides videos of Bible teaching material, particularly for use as English as a second language in the developing world. So I'm involved in lots of different things and had the privilege to get to know Ed and Elle. At the time they were getting married, and just before then. And I've been to Kendal before, so I do remember meeting some of you, and it's great to be here today. So basically what I've been asked to do by Ed is to talk to you about the social action side of local church life. Now, when I was converted at the age of about 15, I was in a privileged background in a private school, and I came to Christ quite dramatically. No evangelical background in my family, and it didn't occur to me particularly very much at the time that salvation wasn't anything more than a transforming experience for me as an individual that would affect my morals and my outlook and my giving and my local church attendance and Bible reading and things like that. Then 3 years later, I went to South Africa. This was in the late 1970s, and I was pitched into the turmoil, the conflict and the tension of apartheid South Africa as it was in the throes of gradually collapsing. Tremendously tense and unjust situation. And as a Christian working with Christians in different communities around the country, I was faced with a whole new series of issues. And I came back to Britain, went to university, and I thought I've got to really rethink my Christianity. And I reread the Bible, and I began to realize that God's heart for the poor is at the very center of Christianity, not in the periphery, but in the center. And so all the way through my Christian life since then, in my marriage and in my family, and in my church leadership and in my personal life, I've always been very focused on considering issues of social justice and social action. So when I started leading the church that I'm still involved with as an elder, Barnabas Community Church in Shrewsbury, one of the first questions I asked is, what can we do for the people most vulnerable in our community? That was in the late 1990s. And I chanced upon a project in the city of Derby, which turned out to be a proto-food bank, a precursor of the modern food bank movement. I was very inspired by this. It was called Basics Bank. And so we started collecting food and distributing it to people who got themselves in debt. And that was in 1996, 97, all that time ago, long before the financial crisis, long before the food bank movement, long before the turbulence in the economy that we've experienced in the last couple of decades. And we just had a small resource in a very small room in a part of our building. We just had a handful of volunteers, and we would serve about 3 or 4, 5 people a week who came in referred by different people. It was a very, very small project, but from that seed has grown an amazing development in our community, which I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. So that's a little bit of my background. Now, our context, of course, is that as a nation, we are experiencing very turbulent economic times for a number of reasons. Some obvious ones to do with energy, to do with the war in Ukraine, to do with environmental issues, and a variety of other factors. We've seen tremendous inflation. We're seeing the government under tremendous financial pressure. We see the gap between rich and poor being stubbornly greater, if not growing at this particular time. So this is a turbulent and a difficult time in our country. But this works out differently in different places, doesn't it? So you may think, well, yes, these things are particularly severe in urban communities and in inner cities. Yes, that's true. But in Cumbria, like in Shropshire, we have rural poverty, and it's a real factor, although it's very often hidden and not much spoken about. We still have council estates with a lot of poverty hidden away in small towns and villages all over rural areas. We have issues of what was called sparsity and the fact that people are separated large distances from each other, which disadvantages people who are poorer, especially when bus services and transport facilities are limited and expensive. And the poorer people suffer more through being separated from each other by geographical distance. And we also have areas of depression, economic depression, even in a county like Cumbria, as you are well aware, and in almost all other rural areas in the country, parts of my county in Shropshire, parts of Cornwall, you can find it all over the country. So there are people in need. And also because of the social impacts of COVID, we're still having tremendous psychological difficulties arising from the trauma that people have suffered through COVID, either through illness in their family, bereavement, or loss of jobs, or the social dislocation that they experienced during that time, the disconnection from family, the missing of key events like funerals and births and birthdays and things like that. So all these things mix together to make our societies, including in Kendal, very vulnerable socially in some ways, despite the fact that some people are very comfortable and they're doing okay. And there are plenty of people in Cumbria who are like that. I've been to Cumbria many times, but there's also real need on your doorstep. And God is interested in every local church taking responsibility for its immediate community. And that's what we've done here in Shrewsbury. When I look through the Bible, I can find many, many things that indicate God's heart for the poor. But let's just talk briefly about one such example, a prominent one, a very moving one, in fact. And it appears in Galatians chapter 2. Paul here has been quite autobiographical in Galatians 1 and 2. He's telling quite a lot about his own story. And there are a number of reasons for that, which we don't need to go into now. But as he's telling his own story, he recounts a very interesting circumstance. He had been preaching the gospel in Greek cities, in what's now Turkey and what's now Greece, to non-Jewish or Gentile communities. He was preaching the gospel in places where it had never been preached before. He was a pioneer. But he was also connected to the Jewish mission back there in Israel or Judea, which was led by Peter. And there was some accusation that Paul was preaching a different gospel. So anyway, he and Barnabas had a very important meeting with Peter and some of his other colleagues. And it was really about whether they were preaching the same message or not. And they were just trying to make sure they were on the same page. And it turned out they were exactly on the same page. But there's a very surprising outcome to this in terms of something that's stated by Paul that we really wouldn't have expected, which is very relevant to what we're talking about today. So I want to just bring this to your attention. In Galatians 2, verses 9 and 10. James, Peter, and John, those reputed to be pillars, that is, pillars of the church, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. Well, all that's fairly straightforward, isn't it? That just basically says they came to a common agreement We're operating the apostolic mission in different areas. We're preaching the same gospel. You work over there, we'll work over here. We'll collaborate when we need to. We'll support each other. We'll protect each other's reputations, and let's advance the kingdom. All very straightforward. But in verse 10, this is added. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor. The very thing I was eager to do. Now, why has that come up in this context? There's no reference to that topic whatsoever beforehand. All of a sudden, Paul introduces this. And here's the reason. You see, Peter and the Jewish mission always had in every church they planted a real focus on the poor people within the church and within the community. It started in the Jerusalem church, and you see in Acts 6 that they appointed 7 men to look after the daily distribution of food and to the widows. So that whole idea of allocating resources, economic resources to people in need and redistributing economic resources was really built into the Jewish apostolic mission. But Peter's question was, is it going to be the same in non-Jewish communities, Paul? Are you remembering the poor? Now, there's a good reason for that. You see, the Jewish communities had the Old Testament. They had a sense of community conscience and community commitment that led them, when they became Christians, to be very focused on caring for the poor. But in Greek society, in the Roman Empire generally, there was very little concept of charity. There was almost no social provision from the state authorities. The only associations of people who gathered together were things like trade associations and things connected with the cults of worship of particular local gods. So there wasn't that kind of social institution of support for the poor in the societies where Paul was working. What's more, research suggests to us that in any city that Paul might be working, there were probably 50% of the citizens who were either economically living on the breadline or below the breadline. 50% on average. That's a huge number of people. So Peter was saying to Paul, if you don't care for the poor within your community when you plant churches, you're not really representing Jesus Christ. And you're not representing the DNA of the church as it should be. And Paul said, don't worry, Peter, we're doing it. We're doing it wherever we go. Now, that is an amazing biblical foundation, apostolic foundation, to persuade us that in any location that we are as a local church, including Kendal, my town, Shrewsbury, anywhere else in the UK, we have to give priority to caring for the people on the margins. Now, they're going to be economically poor, but we know that in our culture, there's another category of poverty that's significant, what we sometimes call relational poverty. People who are isolated, whose personal lives have broken down, who are lonely, who are separated from family and traumatized. There are many, many people like that. So with that in mind, with that mandate in mind, let me tell you just a little bit more of the local story here in Shrewsbury. One of the things I realized as a church leader earlier on is that what facilities you have makes a real difference, whether you have a church building or not, whether you have some other building that you don't use for Sunday meetings, but you can use during the midweek on the high street, or have a warehouse or a shop. All these things really matter. And I know that's a challenge for you. Something to think about in terms of future vision. Because when you have physical capabilities in terms of a building of some sort, there are a lot more things that you can do practically for people, whether you rent it or whether it belongs to you. But we decided many years ago to try and buy a building. We bought a big building. It was an army territorial centre. And we decided over the years to allocate part of the resources of that building to caring for the poor. So there have been various stages of this, but we've actually now got 3 buildings on site, and one of them is wholly devoted to our food bank and associated facilities. Things began to grow after 2010, when the food bank movement developed very quickly in the last period of austerity. And in 2014, we came to a kind of light bulb moment. And I really want to share this with you because this might be helpful for you, because I know you're already involved in the food bank. But one of the things Christians often feel when they're involved in food bank is, if only we could build more of a relationship with people, if only we could connect at a deeper level, there's so much more that we could do. Now, we felt that ourselves. And so we developed a concept which we now call Food Bank Plus. And we developed a whole series of life skills groups for food bank clients and other people in need that we met along the way. Let me just give you some of the examples of things that we do in our church. These are manned almost entirely by volunteers. We have a drop-in to help people with digital literacy and job applications. We have a gardening and woodworking project. We have a cookery project. We have a walking group. It's amazing how many people love that. What an easy way to socialize in a non-threatening way. We also have what we call a talking group, where people who are isolated are phoned up once a week by a member of our team. And we give them ongoing support in times of isolation. We have a creative arts group where there's an artistic lady in our church who just draws people around to be involved in various artistic endeavors. So these are some of the things that we're involved with. And we call the 360 projects. And these are manned by volunteers in the church. In fact, this morning, and I'm recording this just a few days before your event at the weekend, we had our prayer meeting for these projects. And we met for half an hour online for prayer. I led that prayer meeting, and we had 8 other people on the call, all of whom were involved in or leading projects that we're running. And all of whom, interestingly enough, I'm just looking through the list now to check, all of whom are retired. There's an interesting point, which I'll develop a little bit in a moment. But we found, through providing these resources plus money advice, which is another project we run, we're able to engage with and build relationships with many different people. We had a Food Bank Plus Sunday 2 or 3 weeks ago, where we featured all these projects, and there was a little stand for each of these around our hall. We invited volunteers in. Some of our volunteers are members of the church, some of them are members of the community. We invited some clients in. We had a wonderful Sunday. But I met 2 men there, 2 clients who are quite nervous, quite anxious people, had suffered a lot in life. They came to our church meeting for the very, very first time, only because they were accompanied by volunteers and friends, and were able to hear us sing, hear us share our faith together. And one of them said, "I'll be coming back. I was nervous, but I'm coming back to hear some more." So these are the things that we're involved with in our local church. We built it up over the years. We built partnerships with social services and local council and all sorts of people in the community. And it's been a very rich experience. And indeed, our team won the Queen's Award for volunteering 2 or 3 years ago, awarded by the Lord Lieutenant of our county, and 1 or 2 representatives went to Buckingham Palace to receive their awards, because the reputation of Food Bank Plus has grown in the community. And one of the secondary benefits of this kind of role in the community is that many people, businesses, political leaders, council members, those involved in a variety of social services, medical services, and others, they kind of get to know about you, and you become well known. So if I say, to somebody, from Barnabas Community Church in our town, Many of them will say, oh, that's where the food bank is. We've heard about that. We've got a friend who went there a couple of years ago, or whatever it might be. So you've immediately got a sense of connection with people in your community. So let's think about your situation in Kendal. You're a smaller church than we are. You've got a food bank running. You've got a church that's been involved in the community for some time. You've got contacts and networks. But could this be a moment of a prophetic sense of moving forward into something new? Could it be that in the congregation today, there might be somebody with a bright idea of something they'd love to do in the community, an old people's group, a walking group, a life skills group, money advice, debt advice? Are there things that you could do to add on to the food bank that serves the town so well? Food banks work best when they're associated with other projects and they're more holistic, to use the modern jargon, more connected with the needs of people as a whole. So I would commend to you to think big, to leaders, to your church members, and to you as a church. What could we do? It's big ideas that lead to things moving forward in a strategic way. And one of the resources that we've used in our church is the time availability of people who are not in full-time employment. Many of our members, of course, are in full-time employment, or their parents at home, or they're leading very, very busy lives with their jobs, and that's absolutely fine. They can only give a small amount of time to church activities. But most churches are divided between those kind of people and people who've got quite a lot of time. Many of those are retired. We have quite a few retired people in our church. And when I was leading the church, there was a little joke that used to go around that when you're coming up for retirement, you can expect just before your retirement, Martin to be in contact with you with a few suggestions about how you might use your retirement. Trying to keep people off the golf course and off the cruise ships and away from a comfortable, easy, relaxing life. This was the joke that went around. And do you know what? It was half true. Because I still want to encourage people who have time, 50s, 60s, 70s onwards, according to their health and capacities, to give that to the kingdom of God. And sometimes it can be through these kind of volunteering activities. I looked through the list of 8 people that I prayed with this morning. I'm just going to go through them now and say, well, one of them, he's a man who is in his 80s and he helps in the drop-in faithfully every week. He's given at least 10 years of his retirement to Christian volunteering activities. Another man I'm looking at now who was there this morning, he sorts tins once a week and packets and weighs them for food bank. That's kind of his capacity level, but he does a very good job. 2 other ladies that were on the call this morning are very skilled at interviewing food bank clients, very compassionate. They're quite evangelistic, both of them, and they really engage with people at a wonderful level. One lady I'm looking at who's very keen on walking, and she loves taking people out for walks. And we've seen amazing changes in people who are fairly stagnant in their physical lives, and we get them moving, we get them walking, and things open up and they become friends. I think of another couple in their 70s who are on this call who run the talking project. And so they meet with their team once a week, and they have specially commissioned phones, not their own private phones, with a separate number. And during that morning, they phone up all the people on their list and they talk to them. And they've recently had 3 women who've joined, have asked for a weekly phone call. And 2 of them were bereaved in COVID lockdown and haven't recovered from it. And this is a lifeline to them. And then finally, a widow who's moved into our area from the Northwest for family reasons. And turns out she's a really skilled gardener. And she's doing a wonderful job getting alongside clients, doing gardening, and then just getting talking about life. And she's incredibly skilled at that. This is just a snapshot of some very ordinary, committed members of our church. We also have some younger people who have very little time. We've got, for example, like I think of a young mum. She's got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old child. She's got a part-time job, but she gives one morning a week to another project, which is mentoring young women concerning parenting skills, particularly single mums. She brings one of her children along and they talk together, and the other mums bring their children along and they just talk about parenting skills. Incredibly transformative. So I hope that in this short talk, I can inspire you to think again about your church in Kendal and what you can do in your community. One thing that I always advise people to do is, if you want to know what the needs are in the community, go and talk to your local councillors. They know more than anybody else because they're in touch with all the people in need, and they will be able to highlight things that the church can do. And then deploy your evangelistically gifted people alongside the carers and the workers so that they can share about faith. And some of these people I just mentioned are very skilled in praying for people. Just, a need is articulated and they say, let's pray. And there's some wonderful outcomes from that process. So thank you so much for listening. I'm glad to be able to drop in on your weekend. I'd love to have been with you in person. I was glad to visit Kendal a few years ago, and I met some of you then. I've met some of you in other contexts, in Christ Central events and on visits to Cumbria. So thank you so much for listening. God bless you. Have a great rest of the weekend. I know it's coming to an end very shortly, but hopefully this talk can just spark something in Kendal that leads you to the next stage of social engagement in your community. And you can be certain of this. As you go forward responsibly and in faith, God will provide the finance and the time and his blessing on other activities that you do. And another thing in conclusion that we've learned is that when people move to the area, they often join our church because they've heard about our social project. That's an interesting additional benefit. But we do it most of all because there's a biblical mandate. Continue to remember the poor, said Peter to Paul. And that voice from Scripture echoes through the centuries and comes to us right now as we conduct our mission in Britain today. Thanks ever so much for listening. I hope to meet some of you soon. Do say hi to me if you see me in any public events. And thank you, Ed, for inviting me to give this talk.